India barely grows any cashews, and yet it's become one of the biggest cashew processing powerhouses on Earth. Every year, hundreds of millions of kilograms of raw cashews leave African ports and land in Indian factories, where they're cracked, roasted, graded, and shipped back out to the world as a finished product worth billions. So how does a country with almost no cashew farms end up controlling this much of the global cashew trade? That's the story I want to get into. Let's start with something most people never think about. That cashew nut in your trail mix, in your stir-fry, in your box of festive snacks. It went on a longer journey than you did to get to your kitchen table. The cashew tree isn't even from India or Africa. It originated in Brazil, in the northeast coastal regions, centuries ago. Portuguese traders picked it up during their colonial expansion in the 1500s and carried it across the world, to Mozambique, to Goa, to Southeast Asia, planting it wherever the coastal climate would allow. It was almost an accident of empire that cashew trees ended up rooted in Indian and African soil at all. For a long time, that was just a footnote in agricultural history. But somewhere along the way, something interesting happened. India took this imported crop and turned it into an entire industrial ecosystem, one that today touches millions of livelihoods, generates billions of dollars, and quietly shapes trade relationships between India and an entire continent. And here's the twist most people miss. India's dominance in cashews isn't really about farming, it's about processing. India is, in many ways, the world's cashew factory, not the world's biggest cashew farm. If you looked purely at how many cashew trees India has, you wouldn't expect India to be a global heavyweight. India's domestic cashew harvest is respectable, concentrated mainly along its western and eastern coasts. States like Kerala, Karnataka, Goa, Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh, Odisha, and Tamil Nadu all grow cashew. But domestic production alone would never make India one of the top cashew exporters on the planet. So where does the rest come from? This is where the real story begins. India imports staggering volumes of raw, unprocessed cashew nuts, what the industry calls raw cashew nuts, or RCN, from countries thousands of kilometers away. Ships loaded with raw cashew in their shells leave ports across West and East Africa, cross the Arabian Sea, and dock in Indian ports like Mangalore, Kochi, Chennai, and Goa. Once those raw nuts arrive, they enter Indian processing units, where they're transformed, cracked open, roasted, peeled, graded, polished, and packaged into the smooth, ready-to-eat cashew kernels you see on supermarket shelves around the world. In other words, Africa grows it, India processes it, the world eats it. So why Africa specifically? Why not source raw cashew closer to home or from Southeast Asia? The answer comes down to climate, geography, and decades of agricultural investment. West Africa, in particular, has become one of the most important cashew-growing regions in the world. Countries like Ivory Coast, Guinea-Bissau, Benin, Nigeria, Ghana, and Tanzania in East Africa all have the tropical, well-drained coastal conditions that cashew trees thrive in. Ivory Coast alone has grown into arguably the single largest producer of raw cashew nuts on the planet, rivaling, and at times surpassing, even traditional cashew-growing giants. Tanzania, Guinea-Bissau, and Nigeria all contribute massive volumes as well. Here's the part that surprises a lot of people. Many of these African nations produce enormous quantities of raw cashew, but historically have had limited processing infrastructure of their own. Building a cashew processing industry isn't simple. It requires specialized machinery, a trained and available workforce, consistent power supply, quality control systems, and access to global buyers who trust the finished product. Many African cashew-growing regions, for a long time, didn't have all of these pieces in place at scale. India did. Decades before Africa became a major cashew grower, India, particularly the state of Kerala, had already built up processing expertise, starting originally with cashews from its own coastline and from parts of Southeast Asia. So when African production began to boom, India was already positioned as the buyer, with the infrastructure, the labor force, and the trade relationships to absorb it. That's the trade relationship in a nutshell. African farmers and cooperatives grow and harvest the raw cashew. Exporters ship container after container of it toward Indian ports, and Indian processing hubs turn that raw material into a finished, branded, market-ready product. Now let's go inside one of these processing units, because the transformation a raw cashew goes through is genuinely more complex than most people imagine. Step 1. Drying and cleaning. When raw cashews arrive from Africa, they still have their outer shell, and that shell contains a caustic, oily substance called cashew shell liquid, which can burn skin on contact. Before anything else happens, the nuts are cleaned, sorted by size, and often left to dry further to bring them to the right moisture level for processing. Step 2. Roasting or steaming. The nuts are roasted or steam cooked to soften the shell and make it easier to crack, while also neutralizing that caustic oil. In traditional units, this used to be done over open flame roasting pits, a process that was tough and hazardous for workers. Many modern factories now use steam processing, which is safer and more consistent. Step 3. Shelling. This is the step most people picture when they think of cashew work. The roasted nuts are cracked open, sometimes by machine, sometimes still by hand using small hand-operated cutting tools to extract the kernel from the shell. This is skilled, physical work. Experienced shellers can crack cashews with remarkable speed and precision, trying to keep the kernel whole, because a whole kernel is worth significantly more than a broken one. Step 4. Drying and peeling. The extracted kernels still have a thin reddish-brown skin, called the testa, covering them. The kernels are dried again, then peeled, again, often by hand, to reveal the smooth, cream-colored cashew we recognize. Step 5. Grading. This is where quality control becomes an art form. Cashew kernels are graded based on size, color, and whether they're whole or broken. There are dozens of grade classifications in the international cashew trade: W180, W240, W320, and so on, with the number roughly referring to how many kernels make up a pound. Broken pieces get their own grading categories too, and they're not wasted. They're sold into different markets, like baking and confectionery. Step 6. Packaging and export. Once graded, the kernels are vacuum-packed or otherwise sealed to preserve freshness, and prepared for shipment to buyers around the world. The United States, the European Union, the Middle East, and increasingly domestic Indian consumption too, as the local snacking market has grown. Every one of these steps, historically, has depended heavily on human labor, and that's an important part of this story too. Cashew processing in India has long been one of the largest employers of women workers in the country's agro-processing sector, particularly in Kerala, where entire towns have built their economies around cashew factories for generations. This isn't just a story about a snack. It's a story about how value gets created and captured in a global supply chain. When a raw cashew leaves an African port, it's sold at raw material prices. But by the time it leaves an Indian port as a graded, packaged, branded kernel, its value has multiplied significantly. That's the economics of processing. The country that adds the labor, the skill, and the finishing touches captures a much larger share of the final price than the country that simply grows the raw crop. This has made cashew processing an important, and sometimes contested, economic issue. Some African cashew-growing nations have started pushing to build up their own domestic processing capacity, so they can capture more of that value themselves instead of exporting the cheap raw version and importing the expensive finished version back for their own consumers. Several West African governments have introduced export taxes or incentives designed to encourage local processing rather than pure raw exports. At the same time, India's processing industry has become deeply reliant on that African raw supply. Domestic Indian cashew production alone can't feed the scale of India's processing capacity, which means Indian exporters, processors, and traders have built long-term sourcing relationships across Ivory Coast, Tanzania, Benin, Guinea-Bissau, Nigeria, and other producing nations, often through trade associations, direct contracts, and established shipping routes. It's a relationship that benefits both sides when it works well. African farmers get a reliable, large-scale buyer for their harvest, and Indian processors get the raw material volume needed to keep an entire industry, and the livelihoods tied to it, running. No industry this size comes without pressure points, and it's worth being honest about them. Labor conditions in some traditional cashew processing units have drawn scrutiny over the years. Long hours, low wages in some segments, and the physical toll of manual shelling and peeling work. Efforts toward mechanization and better labor standards have been ongoing, with mixed progress depending on the region and the size of the operation. There's also rising competition. Vietnam has emerged as a major force in cashew processing as well, investing heavily in mechanized processing technology and competing directly with India for both raw material sourcing from Africa and finished product sales to global markets like the US and Europe. And then there's the push, mentioned earlier, from African nations themselves to process more cashew locally rather than exporting it raw. If that trend accelerates significantly over the coming years, it could reshape this entire supply chain, meaning India's processing industry will likely need to keep evolving, investing in technology, and strengthening its trade relationships to stay ahead. Despite the competition, India's cashew processing sector isn't standing still. There's continued investment in modernizing factories, improving mechanized shelling to reduce dependency on manual labor, strengthening quality certifications for export markets, and expanding trade agreements with African supplier nations to keep that raw material pipeline stable. What's clear is this: the story of the cashew nut is really a story about global trade itself. A tree that originated in Brazil, transplanted by colonial traders into African and Indian soil, is now at the center of a multi-billion-dollar relationship between two regions, one supplying the raw material, the other supplying the processing expertise, feeding snack bowls, bakeries, and grocery shelves all over the world. So the next time you're holding a handful of cashews, you're not just holding a snack, you're holding the end product of a journey that likely started on a farm in West Africa, traveled by sea to an Indian port, passed through the hands of skilled workers in a processing town, and made its way, graded and packaged, into a global market that spans continents. Now, if this kind of trade genuinely interests you, and you're someone looking to explore opportunities in the raw cashew supply business, especially sourcing from Nigeria, we do have connections in this space that we work with. If you'd like guidance on how this business works, how sourcing and export from Nigeria typically happens, or who to talk to, drop a comment below or reach out to us through the email in our channel description. We'll be glad to connect you and point you in the right direction. If you learned something new about the industry behind your everyday cashew nut, hit like, subscribe for more stories like this, and I'll see you in the next one.